DeKalb Elementary. Okay, hold on one moment. Okay, you cool?
Yeah, I got it.
All right, I'm sorry to rush, but I won't be
Come
but
here, Darius.
20 minutes. I appreciate you.
You okay? Yes. All right. Come on. Come.
Can I make a phone call?
Yeah. D.
Hey, this is real. It's a joke. We're all gonna die today. Stand up. Anyone in those offices?
No.
Hang it up.
What is this?
This isn't a joke.
What is this? What's going on here, man?
Get out of here. You go tell everyone I'm here. This is happening. No one comes in. Call 911. Tell them to hold the police pad. They come in, I'm gonna start shooting.
I'm on 2nd Avenue in the elementary school. There's a gentleman here with a gun, and he said, tell the police to back off or he's gonna start shooting. I'm in the front office.
Good afternoon. I'm Lori Rose. I'm president of the League of Women Voters of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff area, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's program, Gun Violence, Local Impact. If you just walked in, you might have missed a salient moment from the film where a shooter casually pulls an assault rifle from his backpack as he stands in the reception area of a school. We've all been in school reception areas like the one depicted in DeKalb Elementary, a film which is based upon a true story. In 2018, there have been 311 mass shootings, which resulted in 314 deaths and 1,270 wounded. That's nearly one shooting and one death per day, and it's the middle of November. As incidents of gun violence escalate, each of us have faced moments when our thoughts turn to the notion that our lives and those of our loved ones could be cut short by gun violence as we enter a school, a church, a synagogue, an airport, a bar, or a nightclub. Reflection follows disbelief, anger, and tears. We start to ask, what, if anything, can we do? The League of Women Voters is here today because we believe that we can do something. As a nonpartisan organization, we stand firm in our position that gun violence is a problem, and that there are aspects of the problem that can be addressed outside of a purely political framework. As candidates use tragedy to obtain political advantage, and the media turns victims, survivors, and their families into cameos to feed an information-hungry populace, a nonpartisan approach to gun violence may be the only solution. The League advocates restricting access to automatic and semi-automatic assault-type weapons. These weapons present a clear and unequivocal danger to public safety. The League believes that it is essential to restrict or prohibit the possession and sale, manufacture, importation, and transportation of semi-automatic assault-type weapons for private ownership. Additionally, the sale of ammunition for these weapons should be restricted or prohibited. The League also favors restrictive legislation at both the state and federal levels. But we are here today because gun violence has local impact. On the third day of this year, gun violence took the lives of 2 young people on Western Avenue in Lake Forest. I was moved to support today's program when I learned that a local preteen wished to be homeschooled for high school because she was afraid to go to school after several active shooter drills. Today, we rise above the fray to address the local impact of the trauma and solutions available to those of us who choose to avoid the pulpit of a public office. As you listen to the roster of excellent speakers present today, I urge you to find your voice and make a difference. The League of Women Voters of the Lake Forest, Lake Bluff area has been educating and advocating in our local communities for nearly 100 years. Please join us in our effort. Membership information is available at the table near the entrance and on our website at www.lwv-lflb.org. Please follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We welcome you, we thank you for your interest in our mission, and we look forward to working with you in our efforts to end gun violence and defend democracy. And now, I invite you to welcome Nikki Snoblin, our Vice President of Program Action and Advocacy. Nikki.
Thank you, Lori, and thanks to all of you for being here. We're very grateful to the staff of First Presbyterian Church for allowing us to use this space and for graciously accommodating all of our needs. They've been very kind to us, and we're very grateful. We also thank Marlena Cross of Northwestern Memorial Hospital Foundation, as well as all of the League volunteers who've assisted in putting together this event. Today is November 11th, 2018, and as you probably realize, it's the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day, or Veterans Day as we usually call it in this country. It's the day that marked the end of World War I with an agreement that took effect at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. I mention this because it brings to mind the fact that weapons have changed enormously since then. In World War I, bayonets were still standard issue for soldiers. Now guns with almost unthinkable capacity to kill are too often being turned against innocent civilians, even children, and we know it can happen anywhere. Since we began planning this program, there have been 2 well-publicized mass shootings, one at a synagogue in Pennsylvania, one at a club in California, plus hundreds of everyday shootings that never make the news but still destroy lives and communities. Just in the past 72 hours, there have been 228 reported shootings in the U.S., resulting in 83 deaths and 126 injuries in the last 72 hours. What is this doing to us? What's it like to go to school or work or your place of worship knowing that you could be next? What's it like for law enforcement knowing that they may be responding to the next mass shooting event or they may be the targets of it? What is it doing to this generation of young people? An essay appeared in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago, written by an 18-year-old entitled, "I Belong to the Massacre Generation." A recent study by the American Psychological Association found that the threat of gun violence is the #1 stressor for Generation Z, the young people between 15 and 21 years old. We're here today to examine the local impact of gun violence from 4 different perspectives and to seek answers to the following questions. What are the psychological effects of gun violence for those who are affected indirectly, as I would say all of us are? How are schools changing to keep our students safe? How common is gun ownership in our communities, and what are the responsibilities of gun owners to ensure safety? And how can legislation help to reduce gun violence? We also hope to leave everyone with some resources, ideas, and positive actions you can take to work toward a safer community for all of us. Now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Colleen Cicchetti. Dr. Cicchetti is the Executive Director of the Center for Childhood Resilience at Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago, and we're very honored to have her here. Dr. Cicchetti.
Okay, good morning. That was a tough way to start a meeting, so thank you all for being here. This is not a subject anybody wants to talk about, but one that we need to be talking about. So As she mentioned, I run a center at Lurie Children's that is the Center for Childhood Resilience, and we basically are the arm of the public health arm of the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Northwestern Medical School and Lurie Children's. So really my work, I was trained as a traditional psychologist, worked for a long time. I've been at Northwestern for 30 years. I've been at the hospital for all of that time, and I have done traditional psychological work. But what I've started to do in the last 10 to 15 years is to really say, we know there's interventions that work for kids if they make it to our hospital, but most people never make it to our hospital. We think that we get mental health services into the hands of about 20 to 25% of kids in this country that need them, and that's across socioeconomic categories. Many people have no idea how bad their insurance is for mental health until they're in the middle of a crisis, even in communities like this. But in places like Chicago, the dearth of mental health resources is really significant. So our work is really around how do we take what we know will work to heal kids, to help kids develop self-control and self-esteem and all these important things if they make it to the hospital, and how do we bring that knowledge into communities and say, we need to be doing this, all of us together. We cannot mental health our way out of this crisis. There will never be enough mental health providers. So it's up to us as community members, as parents, as teachers, as Girl Scout and Boy Scout leaders, all of the ways that we interact with kids and families to help. So here's our center, just to give you a little bit about us. I'm a psychologist. There's about 15 people on my team, and we spend most of our time interacting with schools. So school mental health is a really big place where we know that if we can get appropriate resources to schools and models, they typically have, most kids who have mental health services, 70 to 80% get them at school. So it's really important that we think about that. We also work in trauma training in any child-serving entity. So work with DCFS and the Juvenile Justice Department and the Girl Scouts and preschools, anywhere that'll listen to us to talk about how we can all do this work together more effectively, and we do training and research as well. So let's talk about trauma. Trauma is this thing that we're hearing a lot about and sometimes gets a little muddled. So what I'd like to share with you is the definition that the Illinois Childhood Trauma Coalition came up with. We're a group of about 160 entities across the state that are interested in thinking about how do we bring this model and this knowledge into all different public serving agencies and communities. So the idea is that there's an event. An event is something that's super scary. It used to be, when we think about post-traumatic stress, we thought of it as a moment where you thought you were at risk of dying. We've now broadened that definition. It could be a moment where you thought you or someone that you love is at risk of dying or being injured very, very much. It's also a situation, though, where the event is necessary but not sufficient. Because what we know is that it's how you make sense of that event. And that is why you might be in a family that all experienced a house fire and have very different symptoms, in part because how old you were, how close you were to the fire, do you blame yourself that that happened? So it's not just the event, but it's your experience of that event, and then it's how long it impacts you. Many of us have had experiences of loss in our lives, and we know that for that first month or two afterwards, we're not ourselves. But after a traumatic event, we expect some symptoms for the first month or two. But if it goes on beyond that, and it's not just affecting your immediate life around that trauma, but starts to impact your functioning across settings, that's when we really think about trauma that's impacting you in much longer and broader ways. So we think about those extreme acute events, those one-time events, those fires, those car accidents, those one-time shootings. But we also have to think about the chronic events, because those can actually be much more impactful. That's when it never feels safe. That's when you're living with domestic violence or a family member with mental illness that's very unpredictable, or if you've had, you're walking through communities where gun violence is happening all the time. Complex trauma is a particular version, which is that it's something that happened ongoing and in your family. So the very people whose job it is to protect you are the ones that are hurting you. And what we know is people who have complex trauma don't form those attachments, don't learn to regulate their emotions in context with other people, and so they therefore actually are much more dysregulated and much more at risk, so therefore much more challenging. The thing about trauma is we need to recognize that when we've done some surveys, about 50% of kids before the age of 18 have experienced at least one. So that's typical. 50% have had at least one. But what we know is if you've had multiple and you haven't had adults around to help you heal through that, that's when it's even more problematic. So the kids who make it to these National Child Traumatic Stress Network, it's a national center that promotes best treatment. Most kids who get there have at least 4 adverse childhood experiences. When we screen kids at the Juvenile Detention Center, 90% of them have at least 6 or 7. Most have more like 9. We've screened kids in neighborhoods in Chicago where I've screened second graders for interventions, and they have already had 10 to 12 exposures to traumatic events at the age of 7. So when we're talking about this problem, it's significant. The other thing we have to think about is that trauma is not something that's happening in a vacuum. So you were just watching that video. I would say this comment is really important, because even if you're not seeing violence yourself every day in your community, we're watching it on TV. How many of you who live up here do some second guessing about if you're going to even drive into Chicago sometimes? The image of Chicago has become this dangerous place. When I was in high school, I traveled in Europe, and I would say I was from Wisconsin, and they're like, don't know it. Near Chicago, oh, Chicago, bang, bang, Al Capone. Not quite, but then we went through the period where it was Oprah and the period where it was, Obama, and now we're back to, oh my God, you live there? It's a dangerous city you live in. So we're in this space and time where kids are growing up feeling all the time that they're at danger. And what we know is when trauma impacts someone, just one shooting, it's not even just that victim and their parent and their family. It's everyone around that. It's that school. I've been in many schools where one of the things we have to do is assign a mental health professional to walk through the kids' day all day long for the first day of school when they get back, so those teachers and those kids can deal with the empty chair in their desk, that empty in their room, right? So we're talking about effects the adults that work in those spaces, it affects those of us that live in the community. And when I ask educators whether they watch the news or not, about half say, yes, I want to know what's happened. The other half are like me who say, I don't want to watch the 10 o'clock news, because if there's a child that's been impacted that I know or care about, I'm going to get that call, and I'll deal with it tomorrow. I want to get a good night's sleep. So what we're seeing is this growing sense of risk. The other thing that we know, this is some data, Healthy Chicago 2.0 is an effort from the City of Chicago and the Department of Public Health to think about how we can promote health and wellness in our city. And what we see here is that, not surprisingly, the range of where gun violence is occurring and where the lowest childhood opportunities are very overlapping. And what we know is about 50% of kids that are Black and brown in Chicago are living in poverty, as opposed to about 2% of white kids living in Chicago. So when we start talking about what's happening here and what that daily exposure is like, it's really important to think about that. But it's also important to remember we're not just talking about Chicago anymore. We used to be able to say, oh, that's a city problem, and that's not happening anywhere else. I think, if anything, the opioid crisis is pointing out to all of us that there is nowhere that's not impacted. When you look at this map of the state, the ones that have the highest intersection of poverty, violence, and trauma, the darkest colors are where it's the highest, and that's not Chicago. We actually have other neighborhoods and other counties that are worse. We also know that many of you are experiencing the move of folks from the city out to the suburbs. So what we're facing is school districts that weren't designed to deal with the types of poverty and the types of trauma and crisis that they have, being inundated with higher needs families and kids. So when we think about, has anyone heard of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study? Okay, wow, all right. I will do a quick and dirty on the adverse childhood experiences. If you want to know more, you can go research it. Just look up ACE study. So the ACE study is really important. It's my favorite public health study. My husband tells me stop talking about this at cocktail parties, but you all came today, so I can talk about it. The ACE study is a study that was done about 20 years ago, and they looked at 35,000 adults in Kaiser Permanente, and they asked, the doctor who started it was an obesity researcher, and he was trying to figure out why half of the people he treats get better and move on with their lives. The other half, he does the exact same treatments and they don't get better. And so he said, what's the difference here? What's going on? And for whatever reason, he came up with this survey, 9 items, and he just had his researchers call people and say, before you turned 18, did any of these following things happen? And the 9 things are child abuse, physical, emotional, or medical neglect, someone in your family who was incarcerated, someone in your family who had prison, someone in your family who had, all these things up here, right? So we've got physical and emotional neglect, divorce, mental illness, incarceration, and you basically score yourself a 0 to 9, just yes, no on those categories if they happen to you. If you look at that, 50% of us have at least 1. 25% of us have 2. But once you get above 4, up to 6, the risk of every single negative health outcome is doubled or tripled. And we're not just talking about depression and anxiety, we're talking about actual physical things, cancer, heart disease, all of these things that are plaguing our country, right? So the adverse childhood experiences data has been around for a while, and people are finally understanding that if we could do things about that exposure, it's not these things that happen to us that lead to these outcomes, it's what happens to our life trajectory. It's whether we're successful in school, the kinds of food we eat, the kinds of things we do, and the more risk factors we have, the more likely we are to have these negative health outcomes. So I didn't bring all my materials on that, but if you want to know more, I'm happy to talk about that. But the other thing that we know is that while these are the adverse childhood experiences, those are the ones that we first studied, we're starting to realize that they all grow in this other space. So if you have any of those ACEs and you also live in communities that are impacted by poverty and poor housing and all of those things, then it's cumulative. Those risks go up dramatically. And the thing that's important for our conversation today is that we've known for about 20 years that exposure to trauma in any one of those forms impacts the very things that schools are trying to do. So we're not just doing mental health in schools, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, because I want to find the kids and that's where they are, or because that's the best way to reach them. We actually know that the impact and things that schools are graded on. They're graded on their behavioral remarks, they're graded on their graduation rates, their attendance rates. All of those are impacted when kids are exposed to lots of trauma. Here's an example of a really interesting study. This was done back at University of Chicago. They were doing this human development project. They were screening and following tons of kids, thousands of kids, and testing them. And what they were looking at was their academic functioning and various things across time. But Patrick Sharkey, the researcher, said, I want to crosswalk the data we collected on school performance with homicides in Chicago and see if there's an effect. And what they found was if you were tested on a week when there was a homicide on your block, your test scores went down. Didn't matter whether you knew that person or not. Just the fact that there was a homicide on your block. So what might that be about? Thoughts? What would cause that? Why would you do poorly on a school test if there was a gunshot and you're a homicide on your block? Scared? Well, yeah, maybe you can't sleep. You're worried about your family. What else? Stress?
Thinking about what happened and not studying.
Yeah, wondering what happened. Am I going to be in danger? What happened to my friend, right? So you're distracted. And what we know is there's all of those things. And sleep is one of them. Because what we found is it's not just on your neighbor, it's in your neighborhood, but it's also what you're listening to and hearing before you go to bed. Kids don't differentiate my block versus your block or even that suburb over there or something that happened in California or Philadelphia, right? Kids are just hearing danger, danger, danger. And the other thing that's really important is in some of the neighborhoods I work, think about how many times this is happening. If I am not performing my best any time there's been a homicide in my neighborhood, I might only be on my best maybe 1 week a month. It'd be really easy to label me as having some kind of a learning disability or not caring or not being motivated, right? So this is a poem that actually, it's interesting that you guys are here from the Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence. They do a competition every year where they have kids send in information about how handguns have impacted them. And a few years ago, I was lucky enough to be at their luncheon when Christian got this the award and came up and actually read it. So I want you to read with me the part that says, "But I can't." So the line, and this is a 4th grader in Chicago Public Schools. I want to go outside and play, but I can't. Not because it's a rainy day, it's to avoid the gunshots that may come my way. I want to go outside and play, but I can't. Not because I have no bike to ride, it's because my mom fears I'll be another victim of a senseless homicide. I want to go outside and play, not because it's after hours, or even that it's way too dark. It's because of all the bloodshed that occurs in the neighborhood park. I want to go outside and play, not because I have no friends, it's because the violence, it seems it never ends. I want to go outside and play, not because I don't deserve it. There's this thing called life, and I'm just trying to preserve it. Yeah, those are some pretty profound words coming out of a 4th grader. What does it make you think about? What is she missing? Childhood. She's missing all those opportunities to go out and figure out how do you manage yourself in the world with the big kids and the little kids and play games and figure out what you're good at. Maybe it's not schoolwork, but it's other things, right? But what's her mom doing that's amazing? Keeping her safe and reading to her and she's obviously an incredibly bright girl, right? So there's a lot going right here, and yet this kid is missing out on so many things that we know are critical if you're gonna learn how to navigate the social world. And so when we start talking about doing social emotional learning in schools, this is part of the reason. Kids don't have the opportunities to learn those skills like the way they used to. And even in highly resource-rich communities, they're not out there navigating the way they used to. Everything's structured. Adults are doing all of this work with them, or they're behind screens. They're not out there just playing kick the can with all these different kids and sort of navigating all of that. So we need to think about how do we address this in our culture. The other thing we have to think about is, what are we going to do? Not all of you are wanting to be mental health professionals or school teachers. So what is your job? Where do you step in here? And this is some of the ways I think are really important when we talk about community trauma. We start thinking about what's happening in terms of the community itself. Are there job and economic opportunities in that community? Can you see someone in your community who's living a successful life and has a path that you believe that you can follow? Is the physical space that you live in comfortable and safe? Are the playgrounds safe? Are there needles everywhere? Do you need to go out and find a place to be safe and have to stay inside your house? And what about in your community? Is that fabric there that if your mom is in crisis or you're scared that you can run to the neighbors and get help? Or are you isolated and you're not letting the neighbors know your business? Right? So these are the kinds of things we start thinking about. How do we address all of these factors that are impacting kids? We also have to own up that it's not just what's happened to the individual, but maybe what's happened to their family and their family before that. We're increasingly finding this thing called epigenetics. We can find and see traces on the genetic markup of babies in utero of stressful events that their moms have experienced while they were pregnant. We are passing trauma from literally pre-infancy to children's lives, and it changes their genetic code. The good news, and the reason why I can do this work, is we also can see genetic changes in kids who've had treatment, and that's really important. We also want to think about some of the new things that are coming into our communities. This trauma associated with being a refugee and an immigrant, we know most of these kids have had pre-leaving their country trauma, oftentimes horrific trauma on the way here. Sometimes, do you know the average amount of time they spend in transit? It's sometimes 18 years for refugee families that they've been living in multiple countries, in tents, where kids have been trafficked and there's no health care and no education. So there's the in-transit trauma. And then guess what? Getting here isn't always so easy, right? So we've got 3 different spaces and times where those folks could be impacted by trauma. And there's all these acculturation issues and parents that are used to be high functioning and be able to provide for their family that no longer can. So we're really seeing this as a new stressor that's impacting schools across our state. And then we think about bullying. We're hearing more and more about bullying. We're hearing about kids saying pretty awful things are happening at a pretty high rate. Many of us experienced bullying as kids, but what we're seeing now is that bullying is happening in much higher frequency. You used to be able to leave the bullies at school and come home and be safe, but now your phone is following you. So that feeling that you're getting in trouble all the time and that things are coming your way and that you can't stop it and you can't turn it off is really important to know. So we know that people have experienced it, and they're not talking about it to their parents, they're talking about it to their peers, if they're talking about it to anyone at all. And we know that bullying can actually lead to the same sorts of outcomes that other sorts of traumatic experiences have, the very same symptoms and the very same trauma. So if it's happening at an intense frequency and they can't get away from it, it's like one of those chronic trauma experiences. So the question becomes, is there some link between all of this and gun carrying? One of the things that we know is that many kids are bringing guns to school, and when you ask them why, it's because they want to protect themselves. Most kids who have a gun with them who are walking into school are saying that it's because they're afraid and they're doing it to protect themselves. When we look at who's most at risk of having a gun or actually using the gun, what we find is bullies are 5% more likely, but if you've been bullied and you're threatened or injured or you're feeling unsafe, you get up to 70%. So when we're talking about high, victimization makes kids anxious and scared, the question starts to become, well, what's going on? It's not causal. We're not saying that being bullied makes you bring a gun and shoot it. But what we know is that that's one additional factor that many kids are exposed to that can also be a form of trauma that can lead to this. The problem is that most kids will not do that. It's a very, very small percentage of kids who were bullied that are going to end up hurting someone or even with a mental illness. What we know is that we can't just go find them. The issue is much bigger, and we have to take a public health approach. So just quickly, a couple things about brain development that help explain some of this. If you see a healthy brain and a 6-year-old brain right here, we see the first thing that you notice is the size change, right? But then there's also all these neural pathways from newborn to 6 years old. Those neural pathways are affected by how we use our brain. And children who've been exposed to severe neglect, often their brains are developing very, very differently. So this is a typical 3-year-old brain, and this is a brain of a child who'd been severely neglected. What's the first thing that you notice that's different? Size, right? So this baby did not get the kind of food or nutrition. But more importantly for us, these critical pathways. These kids have not developed the same neural pathways that are required to help them regulate their thinking, their actions, their behavior. So imagine this kid coming into your school system. You don't get to cut the head open and say, excuse me, how's that brain development going? You've got to try to figure out what to do for all kids. And so we know that kids have a fight, flight, or freeze response. We know that when things are scary and they happen, our bodies are developed to protect us. That was part of how we were developed. That is a good thing. Most of us should be very grateful that we had family members years and years ago that knew to run or fight, because if they didn't, they would have been dead. So this is a good response. The problem that we have is that while all of this is adaptive, it's not so adaptive when your body is constantly in the stress mode. If your body never goes back to baseline, it's always shooting on high gear, those pathways start to be changed. And so these kids who are exposed to chronic trauma and stress are activated all the time. So little things can trigger them. And it ends up affecting their body. These chemicals, adrenaline and cortisol, that are good if you have to think quickly. If you ever been in a car accident or someone was trying to hurt you, you have to think and be strong and move. But if that's on you all the time, you're not stopping and thinking. You're activated. A loud teacher or someone in the classroom can set you off. So we know the brain is impacted. We can see changes in brains, but we also know that we can build resiliency if we really think about it. Brains are capable of growing and changing. Even as adults, we can learn a new language, but it's a lot harder than if we do it right the first time, right? So we really want to be thinking about how do we create these settings where not everyone who's exposed to trauma is going to have all these symptoms, but we need to be thinking about, we as adults creating communities, how do we try to think about protecting our young people? How do we try to say, if a kid is acting out in your setting, not what's wrong with you, what are you doing to interrupt my process, but what's happened to you and what is my job as an adult to help you to heal so that you can function in this setting and in our community and be safe. So we have to do this thing called repacking the backpack. Kids carry around enormous backpacks with all kinds of stuff, but we don't know when they walk into our setting how they feel about adults, the people there, their peers. Do they feel safe? Do they feel protected? Do they feel loved? And so when we talk about creating a trauma-responsive community in a trauma-responsive setting, we're talking about creating those settings where kids, no matter what's going on in their family, whatever's going on in their community, start to believe that they are capable of being successful and being loved and developing those strategies for self-regulation. And that's what this is all about. So we want to start to build those connections. We want to look for opportunities, especially for kids whom school is not a really great place. Where else can they find that sense of community? Is it in the church? Is it in Scouts? Is it in sports? Is it in theater? Where do they go to get that so that they can start to build up those coping strategies and those resiliencies? In schools, that means creating safe environments where kids feel physically and emotionally safe. It means building relationships of trust and caring, and not just with those kids that reach out for help, but for all kids. And it means teaching self-regulation. It means teaching kids how to get triggered, get upset, calm themselves down, and go back on. In Illinois, that means using a 3-tiered system of support that I know Ingrid will talk about in terms of what that looks like here. From a trauma-informed perspective, Harvard Law School came up with this idea of trauma-informed work, and it says you've got to start with infrastructure and plans at the leadership level. You need to train staff. You need to start thinking about what do all kids need to be able to regulate their emotions and to feel safe and connected, and then how do you build those skills in kids who are struggling? And then if they need more, train everyone to recognize that and connect them to services before they end up in trouble or doing something dangerous. Recently, this has come into a model of trauma-responsive schools. This is a definition that we're seeing now across the country that people are trying to say, okay, that's a great word, but what does it actually mean? And I think for today's conversation, I just wanted to focus on some of these really whole school programming things. How do we make a whole school feel safe? So what do we do in terms of making sure that if you, God forbid, have a crisis here in this community, do you have people trained to show up in that setting and try to respond to the emotional needs of those kids and those families? Do you have teachers? Do you have adults in the community? Do you have discipline strategies that keep in mind that if people are experiencing trauma or are scared, some of your strategies may trigger them? Are you training people to de-escalate and not to get more trauma going on? And are you having restorative conversations so when kids do hurt one another and act in ways that we don't want them to, that they can move beyond that and start to cure? Do we have opportunities to think about trauma-informed emergency drills? We just heard an example of someone being afraid to go to school after 2 active shooter drills in their school. How are we preparing kids? Those are scary moments. We need to think about how we do those kinds of trainings. Of course we need our kids to be safe, but just doing the activity is causing them to feel anxious. So are we doing that and then helping bring kids back down and talking about it and making sure they know the real numbers, that it's not likely to happen, but we want to be prepared, just like we do the tornado drills and things like that? Are we doing something on your campuses that really thinks about threat assessment? I think Ingrid's going to talk about that. But also, are we a predictable and safe campus? Do kids know if they're safe or not? And what is going on for bullying prevention? Are we taking that seriously and realizing it's not just in schools, but outside of schools? At the community level, it's thinking about how we might face all of these things in different ways to promote those safe environments, to make sure that we're supporting parents. If you've got parents in your community that are struggling, what are you doing to make sure that they have those safe and stable nurturing relationships with their babies from the beginning so that they can have strong and healthy lives? What are we doing to build the economic and educational environments in our cities and communities where they're hurting? Can we go in and build parks and places that are safe for kids? And can we build that sort of social cultural community, even in spaces up here? When I drive through Lake Forest and Lake Bluff, people are not so close to one another. You have to go get someone's attention if you're in need. Your houses are pretty spread out. Are you going and building that fabric so people really do have those people to talk to? So when we do that, it saves money. That's the good news. We're in a time, we're talking about using nonpartisan approaches. $3 of input to a early child quality home visiting program will save so much money later. Similarly, by investing in these things in schools, we actually see test scores and all of those things like graduation rates go up. So it's not a hard thing to say that if for every dollar put into addressing the impact of adverse childhood experiences, it's a 6-to-1 ratio of being able to generate and save us money in future hospitalizations, incarcerations, and things like that. There's a monetary belief here too. There's also now trauma legislation out there. Dick Durbin just promoted a really impressive Trauma-Informed Care Act that did not make it through Congress, but he's a very smart man. So he took 6 of the 10 trauma-informed things and put it in the Opioid Recovery Act, and boom, we got it. So there's growing opportunities to think about this in many, many different ways. So I think it's important for people to know about that. If you're interested in learning and being part of the Childhood Trauma Coalition, I'd be happy to add you to that list. And the goal is to really think about how do we promote life, resilience across all the different settings that we work in, across all the different communities, and really in diverse settings. So that's the end of my talk. Here's my information, and I look forward to answering questions later.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cicchetti. Okay. That was really interesting, and I imagine some of you probably already have questions that you would like to ask her, and that brings me to a piece of housekeeping that I forgot to mention earlier. We have Joanne and Mary in the back who have note cards. They're going to be bringing them along. If you would like to ask a question later during the question and answer period, raise your hand. They'll pass a note card and pencil down to you, make a note of your question, pass it back, and then at the end, we'll be taking those note cards and asking the presenters the questions. So just feel free to raise your hand if you would like a note card at any point during the presentations. I also want to mention that there's a table with some coffee and I think tea and water and some snacks back here. I know it's a little awkward to get up during a presentation, but if you're near the end, I guess, feel free. And then as we finish up, of course, you're welcome to stay and chat and have some refreshments. I want to introduce our next speaker now, Dr. Ingrid Weimer. Dr. Weimer is the Executive Director of Student Services for Lake Forest Elementary District 67. and she's responsible for overseeing school safety in District 67. This is something she's been doing for the past 16 years, both in that district and in her previous district. And she'll talk to us about our local districts and what kind of measures are being taken. Dr. Weimer?
So, hello everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My interest today is bringing to you some information what local school districts are doing in light of school safety and security. According to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, shootings that occur, approximately 24% happen in the educational environment. That includes early childhood centers and colleges and universities, and of course K through 12 schools, public and private. School shootings in 2018, there have been at least 76 incidences of gunfire on school grounds. Now, in really researching where these statistics come from Everytown, research.org, so there's been some information in the local media that Everytown has a pretty generous definition of what school shooting is. So it includes when a firearm is discharged on a campus, inside a school, or gunshots end up on campus, and it includes university level as well as early childhood centers. And it can happen at 24 hours. And so if you're somebody who really feels that the Everytown research is a little bit too generous, so I would encourage you to look at their website. I have a visual with me. I'm not actually filling a vase of flowers. There's a reason for this. This represents 76. There's 76 rocks in this container. And if you feel that Everytown is very generous, you can go through. They have a heat map on their website, and you can go through and you can click on the incidences. And if you say that something doesn't fit a definition, for example, there's one statistic about a professor who shoots himself in a bathroom, presumably or allegedly over a protest for the president, and you feel like since that was a self-inflicted wound on a university campus and shouldn't belong in that 76, you can take that one out. There's one of a 34-year-old man who commits suicide in a school parking lot at 2 in the morning. If you feel that that's too broad of a definition, you can take that out. I myself, having been a school principal for 6 years, I would say that that would cause a significant disruption to the school that next day, answering questions from media and parents and students. And if something happens on our campus in the middle of the night, even though none of our students were physically at risk of harm, it's going to cause a great disruption. There's likely going to be a police presence. There's likely going to be an investigation. That vehicle and caution signs could be there. So it will impact the school environment. But I urge you to track this website and make your own judgments about it. There are many incidences that truly do belong in school shooting statistics in 2008. Happened in Dixon, Illinois, not too far from us, only a couple hours. Noblesville Middle School, you may have remembered. That's only 3.5 hours. An academy in Battle Creek had a school shooting in 2018. So one thing that we want to do at the school level is make sure that we're not too complacent, that it could never happen here. We live in very idyllic communities, and there's amazingly wonderful features about Lake Forest and Lake Bluff and all of our neighboring communities. We just need to make sure that we understand that Mental illness does happen here. Their danger could erupt in a school at any moment. So we want to make sure that we're not complacent and dismissive of best practices in school safety. In fact, some of the larger K through 12 school shootings that have occurred and resulted in multiple deaths have communities that are similar to ours. I won't go through this because you can see it, but those are some of the hallmarks. So what I really want to concentrate my time on is what can schools do about it? There's scary statistics. Kids are dying in our schools. Teachers are dying in our schools. And it's not happening at the rate, frequency, and intensity that's happening in other developed countries. So we want to make sure that we're protecting our students, our staff, our visitors, our parents that come to our schools, our grandparents, anybody on our school grounds. There are things that schools can do, and there are things that school districts are doing. We learn from others. When there's a major school event, or even minor, there's a lot, the Department of Justice, the school district, local law enforcement, they're really studying those and coming out with information from minute by minute of what happened, and then precursors of where perhaps was there early indicators or warning signs that could have possibly been better addressed, whether something was missed in the safety protocol, in handling if that was a known person or student. So we definitely learn from others. We stay connected, we stay current. We collaborate with our first responders. All of the schools in Lake Forest and Lake Bluff, whether they're public or private, have great relationships with police and fire. We meet with them very regularly. I would say in Lake Forest, we probably meet with law enforcement and the fire department, first responders, at least 5, 6, 7 times. And then we have school resource officers that work most closely with the administrators in those districts. Schools have emergency management system, so we model that after FEMA. So the Federal Emergency Management Agency has an incident command structure. Schools follow that. We have an incident commander, we have communications officers, we have logistics, operations. It's very multifaceted. So we identify who within a school and within a district are those key people and who their backups are. The management system, what most districts have is a 4-phase program. So you can see the phases. We work hard on prevention efforts, those proactive efforts that we do in schools, and then preparedness. Are we prepared for all of those different scenarios that could happen in a school? And then response would be during the response, what are our protocol and how have we communicated that out and practiced that? And then recovery. What do you do in the psychological aftermath and physical aftermath? So phase 1, I gotta make sure I don't miss anything. Because then I'll be driving home saying, oh, I missed that. So in phase 1 of prevention, that's where we look at all our mitigation efforts. And here's an example, physical site assessments. You can actually have an independent company come in and do a safety and security physical site assessment, or school districts can choose to do that on their own. But you're really looking at what is your visitor management protocol. Those of you that have been in local schools lately, chances are very great that you've been asked to produce a photo ID. And what happens with that photo ID is we sync that with an online database. So in the office, it will rapidly check your name and birth date against a 50-state sex offender list. And if that shows that there's a hit on that there's a match, then automatically it will alert, it'll alert me and my district, whoever the district has set up. So principal, office staff, and you will not be allowed to proceed into the school. Also, with the visitor management protocol, you see in our schools, local schools have multi-tiered entry systems. So very unusual in this day and age to find a school where there's only one door that separates you and the students or the teachers. There's usually a series, and it's usually 3 tiers, 2 to 3 tiers, where there might be an outside entrance with an intercom where you state your name and your purpose for your visit, and then you come into a vestibule, and then you give a little more information. That might be where there's a little visitor exchange window, a transaction window, where they run your driver's license and print a badge for you and make sure that your reason for entering is plausible. And then another layer is then you're in the office, and then you're face-to-face with the office staff, and then you get buzzed in electronically into the main artery of the school. So that's very common what you'll see. Most schools use some programs called Raptor or Lobby Guard. There's a lot of them out there that help us vet who our visitors are. And then architectural and environmental features. So you'll see, for example, we even have some protocol on making sure that we don't have huge shrubs near the entrance where somebody could hide, for example, and try to get in when somebody who is a legitimate visitor gets in. So you'll see we've changed, some schools are mindful of their landscaping. You try to, as much as possible, give natural surveillance, which is visual surveillance, over just artificial, which would be like a two-way monitor or cameras. And professional development, part of our professional development efforts is to make sure that we're getting in front of our teachers as much as possible to keep safety and security on the forefront of their minds, and that they're practicing and communicating with their students. And professional development, as Dr. Shikhedi said, we have been doing trauma-informed counseling professional development for our mental health workers in our schools. And social emotional factors and social emotional learning, bullying was talked about. We are really taking a deep look at bully prevention and awareness, also social emotional learning, which breeds empathy, tolerance, self-awareness, all those types of key hallmarks. There's actually the Illinois State Board of Education has a very robust learning standards, set of learning standards in social emotional learning, and districts are implementing it, and if they're a public school, it's mandated curriculum. And some of the other proactive, well, I'll stay on this slide just for 1 minute. Behavior threat assessment. So we look at our students, because you can see from back to the protective measures and prevention, there's protecting ourselves against an external threat, against an intruder with harmful intent, for example, that doesn't belong in the school community. But as you can see probably in the news from school shooting incidences, we can protect against external forces, but we also have to make sure that we are paying attention to a threat that could be internal. It could be a student that we have that has every legitimate right to be there, that comes through the doors in the morning. So we have to make sure that we have external measures and internal measures. And one of our internal measures on the prevention side is making sure that we're keying into our students. And multi-tiered systems of support, which is what are our universal or our tier 1 preventative measures? What do all kids get? What do we expect of all kids? And tier 2 is if we're teaching empathy, tolerance, self-awareness, anti-bullying, but some students aren't getting it. They're not living it. They're not walking the talk. How do we address that? So that would be a tier 2 intervention. That would be a tier 2 intervention. And then we have tier 3 for our most vulnerable students. Preparedness, this is all the logistics of preparing. Our response, this is our protocol during. As you saw some of that in the introductory film, how do we notify everybody of a lockdown situation? How do we respond in the moment to protect the kids? How do we empower everyone to act? And how do we account for everybody afterwards? The last slide is about the aftermath. We have plans, but of course, these plans, like here's a sample of what is in all of our classrooms. We have some posters and we have emergency management plans, and then we have comprehensive plans for the aftermath. But of course, every situation is different and you can't possibly plan for everything. So we would have our teams come together and schools would lean on each other. We would provide resources to private schools and our counseling teams, as well as Lake Bluff and the high school. We would all rapidly collaborate together. So there are things that schools can do. There are things that we are doing to try to protect our students and our staff as much as possible. How's my done? All right.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weimer. I know that we appreciate the work that you do in our schools every day to keep our students safe, and it is much appreciated. Our next speaker is Roman Buckberger. He is a deputy with the Lake County Sheriff's Office. He's going to be speaking to us a little bit about gun safety in the home. We were trying to gather some information on the prevalence of gun ownership in our community, and that turns out to be extremely difficult. We can find out how many people own a firearms identification card, firearm owner identification card, FOID card. That doesn't necessarily mean they own a gun. The data for Illinois overall shows that there are, I believe, more guns than the number of residents in the state. Now, of course, that would include people who collect guns and could have dozens of them that are, historic pieces or whatever. It could also include people who are stockpiling weapons for a mass shooting event. So it's really difficult to tell. We can't tell you there's a good chance your next door neighbor has a gun or not, but Roman is going to talk to us about people who do have a gun in their home. How should they be keeping their family safe and their neighbors safe? And perhaps if you are concerned about your neighborhood, you might have questions about how you can talk to neighbors about whether there are guns in the home and how they're being stored. So, Roman?
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? First off, thank you for being here. Sunday, Bears are on. Don't have many nice warm days left in front of us here. I will do this, and I'm going to try to give you pertinent information without just kind of overloading. You have some fantastic speakers here who have a lot of information to share. Mine is much more on the base level. Mine is more at the application level at its foundation. To give you, first off, as far as your individual safety, understanding that this is a tough topic to talk about, whether you don't want any or you believe that it's a right and all that stuff, that's not what I'm here for today. What I am here for is that everybody needs to have some civility as having a conversation of what's acceptable in their communities. So anything that I tell you here is not going to be universal to everyone. Someone's going to choose to maybe apply this, and somebody else is going to choose to dismiss it, and that is their right. Okay? And we have to be respectful of that even if we disagree with it. Home safety as far as firearms should be simple enough. Everybody understands the concept of what it is, and we understand how dangerous it can be. But unfortunately, in certain communities or certain parts of the country, there's this belief that if I just don't want to deal with it, it doesn't affect me. I've heard from different communities talk about, well, we have to know or want to know how this affects me here. And I kind of look at everybody and I'm like, understand that just because you're here does not mean that somebody else can't interject into it. It doesn't mean that you're not eventually someday going to go to college, possibly in a completely different state. Doesn't mean that you're not going to be going shopping one day and find yourself in the same situation. So rather than being public gun safety in the home, it's just personal safety overall. First and foremost is going to be the best fight you can have is the one you never have to have. You need to understand and be very attentive to your surroundings and understand that this is just where you're at, just like when you're driving in a car. When you were 16 and you first got your license, it seemed overwhelming. All the cars were driving all around you. It just was too much to comprehend. That's why you always had little stickers, be patient, driver learning here. It's the same thing with what you're doing here today. I don't want anybody to raise their hand when I ask this. But when you came here today, how many actually did an overall assessment of this room, and if something were to happen, would know what to do or where to go or what they would do? And again, don't answer. I don't want anybody to put themselves in that spot. I'm not going to lie, guys. I'm the one with all the big yellow patches all over me. I did. I've never been here before. The first things I did was looked at the exits. I also had to understand where I was sitting relative to anything else, because even if somebody has an individual, a medical assistant, guess whose responsibility it's going to be? Mine. So when I come in here today, I think about where I'm parking, because that's one of the things that I'm going to do. I understand that this is a little bit more than what the normal day-by-day is, but you can control a lot of this. The public outnumbers the police department. If we woke every single police officer up and got him out of bed today and put him on the street, the public's going to outnumber us approximately 550 to 1. Which means ultimately these problems that I've heard so far today, which has been really interesting information, still falls down at the foundation of how is society dealing with it and what is the individual either motivated or capable of doing. So as an example, the sheriff's office, I went to a class called Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. CPTED is the acronym for it. And basically what it is it touches base on what the doctor just talked about. One of the things that us, or myself and 3 other people, the sheriff's department, is supposed to literally go out, go to any, whether it be business, home, school, whatever, look at what you have and say, as a governing body, what are your priorities? What do you want? And then I'm going to tell you where your strengths and where your weaknesses are. And then it's up to you to decide whether you want to apply them or not. So this is something that we've implemented in Lake County as far as the sheriff's office. I can't speak for every other department. I don't have a list of those. But this is the sheriff's office way of saying, listen, we want resources to all the people in Lake County so that we can give you a perspective that you might not be used to seeing, give you ideas and something to challenge you with. We went to a church, and I'll keep it as vague, that was out west. And it was it was a wonderful church, had a lot of history, but unfortunately it was very limited because of the time that it was built and designed. It didn't offer a lot of options. So we had to have some serious conversations with the folks there, as far as the body, as far as what they could do to help keep the parishioners safe. Okay? And that meant having a real hard conversation. What I am going to challenge each of you to do is when you leave here today, I don't want you to be overwhelmed, and I don't want you even to necessarily say anything right now. I just want you to compress it a little bit. When you wake up tomorrow, are you going to take an initial step to make a plan as to what you are going to do if the fire alarm goes off? Well, we all know we're just going to leave. Well, I got news for you. Although I know it's part of you're supposed to have the law on the wall as far as where you're supposed to go, I'm going to bet my paycheck that most of you didn't look at it when you walked in here today, which means everyone's going to go someplace else. Sorry, don't mean to throw you guys under the bus. It's just human nature. I'm sure that the doctors can back me up on some of this. I'm making an educated assessment on these. Okay, which also means that it's our human nature to want to assume the best all the time. Anybody disagree with that? When I show up and I do stuff, even when I'm not in all of this, part of what I'm supposed to be doing, and yes, I have to put a disclaimer here, yes, I've been in the military 3 different times. Yes, I've been in an undercover unit for 3 years. Yes, I've been in an attack team. I am not pro-firearm. As a matter of fact, I tell everybody that I don't do this when I'm not in it, to be honest. I tell everybody I'm a garbage man. Okay? Don't laugh. No one ever asks you a question after that. But it's important because as I'm walking around my daily life, you'd be surprised that just simply sitting in a restaurant, I start making an assessment. Because Business or workplace is also high risk as far as any type of workplace violence. We have an entire program that we've committed to going out and doing these assessments to businesses in Lake County. And I know this is specific to firearms, but it's not just firearms that we talk about. We talk about their security, challenge points, and we actually challenge other employees about making an assessment to their workspace as well as their fellow employees so that everyone's on the same page. You know what? We're not going to think about it when it happens, because, ladies and gentlemen, if that happens, you're going to fail. You are going to have that moment, and the verbiage that I would usually use is a little offensive, but it's that you will actually stop breathing. You will get tunnel vision. You will lock up. And then when you finally come back down to it, it's all going to flood at you at once. You are not going to rise to the occasion. Okay? I don't want anybody, and now although I have not been anointed the spokesperson for Lake County Police. The chief of police didn't nominate me, my sheriff did, to be here today. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to be responsible for what you are going to do. You have to have a plan in place. Don't wait till you get a flat tire to make sure you have a spare in the trunk. So when we talk about your home, you need to be proactive. You need to understand that your kids may be going to somebody else's home that you not necessarily can't control. You don't know what they're going to come across. You don't know what they're going to see, and you have to do this. With my own nephews, I have an issue with, because as they go through the toy aisle, it's very difficult to tell the difference between a real firearm and a fake one. So I have told my nephews straight up, I will, if I even see you touch it before you talk to your mom and dad. One of them gets it, the other one, they're twins. I'm working on it, okay? But this is a true story. We talked about rifles. I have a rifle in my squad car right now, and yet my neighbor got his grandson a pellet gun that from a distance I could not tell the difference. I didn't know the difference until I literally took it from him and flipped it over, and I could see that the ejector door was obviously one piece. And this is what we are putting out or making available to kids. It's really setting them up for failure, even when they're not potential offenders in any kind of crime. I'm asking you that when you do this, you have to have these conversations with the children, and you have to have them amongst yourselves. Okay? Not arguments, legitimate adult conversations to find out what is the most applicable for in your communities and what you can do. And then take a second for yourself and your family, that when you walk out of that home, which is supposed to be that's your happy place, what are we going to do out there? If we're driving down the road and we see something, what is our family plan? What are we going to do? Don't assume it'll never happen, because you don't know when it's going to happen. You don't know. Most of the time, an offender who's planned it has already got themselves into a position that they're ready to go. That is not the time for you to have to decide with your children, which one are you going to call 911, which one are you going to run, and what we're going to do. I'm not saying that you have to go, because I know we were talking about as far as the psychology and the stressors that come with it. You don't have to title it. You just like the fire alarm. We don't want to ever think about this wonderful place catching fire, but we still practice about it in a hypothetical sense to get people to at least respond to it. Your personal safety is also included in this. Do you know what to look for or talk to your kids about when they're going to their friend's house? How many of you actually have your kids, not just because you have your phones, but have them check in when they get there and have them tell you before they leave? Okay? Again, sounds great, and I got a tracker on the phone. That's not perfect. Every time we make something that's convenient, we can also manipulate it. Okay, and that gets into a whole other public safety thing as far as the stuff that kids do to their phones and everything else, which I won't get into. Yeah, but I see everybody nodding, so I think they know where I'm going with this. Okay, my point is that as I step away here to keep it on point, thank you, A, for being here. Thank you for having the conversation. Listen to the people that are up here. But when you leave here, ultimately all this information is on your shoulders as a community to decide how you're going to use it. Okay, the police departments, our average response time for something like that, even if I drive like I stole it, is going to still be anywhere between 3 to 5 minutes. Because someone has to be a victim of that crime, they have to assess it, they have to report it has to be reported to me, and then I have to get there. Which means ultimately the response or that action is going to be on you. Whatever you choose to do, there is no wrong answer. You're going to do what applies to you. But whatever you choose, make sure you're the best at it you possibly can be. Because if that bell goes off, this is all about you at that point. Yes, the cavalry is coming. Yes, you have men and women that will break windows and jump out of planes in order to get to you. But the first step is ultimately going to be your guys' assessments and your guys' actions to start. I'll keep it short and sweet. and hopefully I'll get some questions from you afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roman. I have heard you speak many times, and it's always a pleasure. I want to mention that Roman has another commitment this afternoon. If he's not able to stay until question and answer, I would be happy to share his office phone number with you, and he welcomes phone calls and emails from the community. I want to remind you again that if you have questions for any speaker, raise your hand so that the people who are passing out note cards will see you, and they'll give you a card. Our next speaker is Sarah Koniznik. She has a handout that she's asked us to pass around, so we're going to have people passing them from the ends and you know, pass them in. I don't think we have quite enough for everyone, so if you're with somebody else, perhaps you can share, but she's going to be going through that with you interactively, and I think it's a good take home for you also. A couple things I'm going to mention now, and I'll mention again at the end. This slide is going to sit up here until we're finished. Many of the resources that you've heard referred to today, like Everytown, and then also a lot of the resources that we used in preparing for this program, we've put on our website at lwvlflb.org/gun violence, and it's just a listing by category of a lot of different sources. Vetted as best we can to make sure that they're reliable sources of information. And another thing, and I'll mention this at the end, was when you came in and sat down, there probably was a feedback survey on your chair. At the end of the program, please do take a minute to fill that out. We'll have people collecting it at the door before you leave. We didn't have enough for everybody, so if you don't have one, there it is, lwvlflb.org/feedback. We really want to hear from you. We want to know what you liked, what you didn't like, and so on. So now we have Sarah Koniznik from the Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence, which is an organization dedicated to reducing death and injury caused by firearms. They educate the public, they work with special interest groups, and they advocate for legislative goals to reduce easy access to firearms. Sarah?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I do work for the Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence, and one of my primary responsibilities, the thing I spend most of my time on, is running the Illinois Gun Violence Prevention Coalition. And that is the name that you will see at the top of the handout that we're going to go through in a few moments. But to begin, I would like to say you have heard a lot of sobering, perhaps even disturbing information today, but there's one thing that I would like everyone to leave here today knowing, and that is we are winning in the fight against gun violence. We are winning. It may not seem like it, but we are winning at the national level, the state level, and the local level. It may not feel that way right now, so please hear me out. I'd like to make a case for the statement that I just made. 3 years ago, I was a university-level instructor with 17 years of experience behind me. I started at that time, in the fall of 2015, the first Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America local group in the northern suburbs. It was me and one other woman. Today, there are over 6,000 members of Moms Demand Action in the northern suburbs, and 8 local groups and counting. We are growing by the day, and when I say we are growing, I don't just mean Moms Demand Action. I mean the gun violence prevention movement as a whole. So again, 3 years ago, I started working as a volunteer advocate for gun violence prevention. The experience was so transformative. By January of 2017, just after the inauguration of Donald Trump, I started seeing not 8 to 9 members, 8 to 10 members at a monthly meeting of Moms Demand Action. I was suddenly seeing 25 to 30, which at the time seemed like huge growth. We've seen even greater growth in the 2 years since. However, beginning in about January 2017, the power of grassroots activists to change the narrative, to change the reality of gun violence in our lives was so inspiring to me that I ended up leaving behind a 17-year teaching career to become a full-time professional gun violence prevention advocate. Thank you. I don't regret it because I'm inspired every single day by people at the grassroots level who are willing to take action every day in big ways and in small ways to help us address this problem. And I'd like to give you some more evidence for the growth of our movement and why we are winning. The Illinois Gun Violence Prevention Coalition 18 months ago represented about 25,000 people statewide who belong to approximately 90, mostly small, faith and community organizations. Today, 18 months later, the Illinois Gun Violence Prevention Coalition represents 160 member organizations and nearly 250,000 people across the state. That is an increase of well over 800% in 18 months. So we've seen that kind of growth not just here in the northern suburbs in the gun violence prevention movement, not just in the state of Illinois, but also across the country. The gun violence prevention movement is growing by leaps and bounds. And when I say we are winning in the fight against gun violence, in every fight, there are two teams, right? At least two. There are two sides, okay? And in this fight, the fight to end gun violence, our opposition is the corporate gun lobby. The goal of the corporate gun lobby, it has been for decades. I would be happy to come back on a different occasion and tell you the history of how the corporate gun lobby was so successful at fulfilling its mission over the last several decades. But for now, I will just let you know, the corporate gun lobby, which is our opposition in this fight, their goal is to normalize the possession of guns in American life. What they want is guns to be as ubiquitous as cell phones. And the thinking goes like this. If everyone in America thinks everyone else in America has a gun, then they're more likely to go out and buy a gun. This is about money. That's all it's ever been about. It's about making money for the firearms and ammunition manufacturers. Our opposition are not responsible gun owners. Our opposition are not hunters. Our opposition are not hobbyists who collect guns. Our opposition is the corporate gun lobby that for decades has used fear in order to increase its profits. Our goal, those of us on the other side of this fight, our goal, the gun violence prevention movement nationwide throughout the state and at the local level, is to balance the legitimate Second Amendment rights of responsible gun owners with the right of everyone, including those gun owners, to live free of the threat of gun violence. And what we're really talking about is cultural change. And cultural change happens in two ways. If you look at previous experiences from American history, the civil rights movement, the fight for marriage equality, smoking, drunk driving, cultural change happens in two ways. It happens through legislation, but it also happens through changing the culture around whatever that issue is that you're trying to address. So that is the purpose of the Illinois Gun Violence Prevention Coalition. I gave you a statistic a few minutes ago about how we've grown throughout the state in the last 18 months. I can tell you, as someone who's been a gun violence prevention advocate for 3 years, there has been an absolute sea change in the last 18 months in our progress on changing both legislation and regulations around the safety of guns and the culture around guns. I have some facts to back that up, but I'd like to, since I know we're going to focus today on state and local changes, things you can do at the state and local level. That's what I've been asked to talk about today. But I'd like to leave you with one fact that backs up what I said about how we're winning in this fight, not just locally and at the state level, but throughout the country. As of Tuesday evening, for the first time in American history, a majority of the House of Representatives are supportive of gun safety legislation. That only happened because of the grassroots activism that we've seen in this movement in the last 2 years. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the national level at this point, but please keep that in mind because it's a huge, significant change. you're going to see progress in federal level legislation. It hasn't come yet because we're still active at the local and state levels primarily, but it's coming. So the Illinois Gun Violence Prevention Coalition, so if you'd like to refer to your handout here, that's the logo that you will see at the top of the page. In the coalition, we have 2 goals, and I mentioned them briefly, but I'll repeat them because I'd really like to keep them in mind. We have 2 goals. The first is to pass gun safety legislation at the state level, and the second, as I said, is to change the culture around guns. Changing the culture around guns, in my opinion, is the most important thing. Legislation is important, but changing norms, changing expectations, changing people's views on what's taboo and what's not is actually the far more important goal that we're pursuing. Because it's only through, I'll give you another statistic that is pretty shocking. I wasn't at all surprised to hear, I believe it was Nikki Snoblin, who mentioned that in their research in preparing for today's event, they found that there are actually more guns in the state of Illinois than there are citizens of the state of Illinois. That does not surprise me at all, and I'm sure that is exactly true, because it is definitely a fact that there are more guns in the United States than there are American citizens. So the way I look at it is this. I kind of think of guns like cars, right? They're such an integral part of our society. There are so many of them. In our lifetimes, they're not going anywhere, okay? Just like cigarettes aren't going anywhere. Alcohol and cars aren't going anywhere. So what we have to do is figure out a way to reduce the threat, just as we've done with those other objects and aspects of American life that can have fatal consequences. So that's why changing the culture, changing expectations about what people deem acceptable and unacceptable about the usage and ownership of guns, that's why it's such an important part of the work that we do. And in a few moments, I'm going to tell you how you can be a part of both the legislative change and part of the effort to change the culture around guns. So let's begin what you can do to combat gun violence. And we're going to focus on the local and state levels, like I said. At the local level, you can get involved in stopping the sanctuary county movement. Some of you may have heard of the sanctuary city movement, where cities throughout the United States, some of them, are claiming that, or stating that they are a sanctuary for immigrants and refugees. They're not going to turn over their citizens to ICE. So in Illinois, there is a movement to turn counties into sanctuary counties. And several counties in Illinois have already agreed to do this. The county boards have passed resolutions saying that any gun safety regulations or legislation that is passed, they are simply going to ignore. They're not going to implement those laws and regulations. So in the coalition, we can help you get involved in that if that's something that you're concerned about. Now, I don't want anyone to go home too scared about that. These are non-binding referenda, okay? That's usually what gets passed at the county level. So they don't have a lot of teeth, but they're important. It's important to fight back against the sanctuary county movement because it demonstrates our strength as the gun violence prevention movement. The second thing you can do at the county level is request county level referenda. Again, they're not going to be binding, but any county level referenda that will decrease the threat of gun violence is relevant and helpful because it helps us change the culture around guns. Changing the culture involves changing public opinion, right? Changing what people talk about, putting it out there in the public space so that people are discussing it and having the kinds of conversations and dialogue that we're having today. It's all really important and it all helps, even if referenda are non-binding. And I'd also like you to keep another fact in mind about county level government here in Lake County. And again, this supports my statement that I began with, that we are winning in the fight against gun violence. Before Tuesday, there were 21 members of the Lake County Board. About 3 were strongly in favor of gun violence prevention regulations and legislation and were willing to take action. About 3 of those 21, another 3, were very supportive of the Illinois State Rifle Association and not not friendly to our cause, those of us who are trying to reduce gun safety, or excuse me, reduce gun violence. The remaining 17 just simply didn't really want to talk about it, right? They just wished the issue of gun violence and our whole fight would go away, okay? As of Tuesday, the calculus changed dramatically. In the Lake County Board, 5 gun violence prevention, gun sense candidates were elected. 5. So we now have a majority of Lake County Board members who are supportive of our issue, gun violence prevention. So it's really a good time to get involved in gun violence prevention at the local level. The next thing you can do at the local level is make sure your local school board delegate to the IASB, that's the Illinois Association of School Boards, make sure that they intend to vote later this week no on the resolution that will allow school districts in Illinois to arm their teachers. And if you really got a lot of motivation and energy this week and some free time, we'd love to have you join us at our protest at the Illinois Association of School Boards Conference, November 16th through the 18th. And there's Elise Houtman, who runs the Vernon Hills Moms Demand Action Group. Her email address is there on your handout if you'd like to join that protest downtown later this week. She can share information with you about it. So that brings us to the state level, and I'll try to finish up pretty quickly here. At the state level, there's a lot you can do to help support the gun violence prevention movement and legislative change. There's an extremely important bill called Combating the Illegal Trafficking of Guns Act. This is a gun dealer certification bill, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about today because of time, but there are fact sheets on the table. Do you see the purple tapestry of Jesus? Right underneath that tapestry, you'll find fact sheets about this bill. This bill was originally introduced 16 years ago in the Illinois General Assembly. It was only through the grassroots activism, the massive growth in grassroots activism, we finally got this bill passed after 14 years out of the Illinois Senate in April 2017. Not quite 1 year later, we passed it out of the Illinois House, which was a much heavier lift. The purpose of the bill is to make sure that gun dealers in Illinois only sell guns to people who should have them, that they do not sell guns to people who have a history of domestic violence abuse or mental illness or a criminal history. So that's what this bill is about. The bill passed, as I said, the Illinois House, which was its final hurdle, in February of this year, 2018. 2 weeks later, Governor Rauner vetoed the bill because he felt that he was going to lose the primary to Jeannie Ives, and he did not want to anger his base. So we went back and we rewrote the bill together this time with a Republican senator, Chris Nybo, and the new version of the bill is what you see here in front of you, SB 337. That's what the fact sheet is about. The new version of the bill addresses all of the concerns that Governor Rauner and some of the Republican legislators who had voted against the bill didn't like. We took those provisions out and went on to pass the new version of the bill along with 2 other gun safety bills, making it the most successful legislative session in the history of the gun violence prevention movement in Illinois. We passed not only gun dealer licensing a second time in May, we also passed the firearm restraining order, which is a red flag bill that will allow family members or law enforcement to remove a gun from the possession of someone that they feel is a threat to himself, herself, or others. It's a very important gun safety bill that will do a lot to reduce the threat of domestic violence and mental illness. And that bill will become law on January 1st, 2019. We also passed a bill called the 72-hour waiting period. Again, as of January 1st, 2019, you will have to wait 72 hours to purchase a gun in Illinois instead of 24 hours. So really important gun safety legislation, which brings me back to SB 337. After signing the other 2 bills into law, the firearm restraining order and the 72-hour waiting period, Governor Rauner announced that he will veto our gun dealer certification bill. So what we need everyone to do is please call Governor Rauner and ask him to sign it. There are call sheets under the tapestry of Jesus with scripts. All you need to do is grab some call sheets, make a phone call, call now, call this afternoon, because all you have to do is leave a voicemail message, and ask Governor Rauner to sign the bill into law. Ask your friends and family to do the same. Take as many of the call sheets as you would like. There's also a petition, and if I think there was someone I was speaking to earlier, if you could start to pass that around. We're collecting signatures. So far, we have over 50,000 signatures that we're going to present to Governor Rauner, probably within the next week or two, asking him to sign the bill into law. So if you have not signed that petition, please do. Finally, contact your Illinois House Representative and Senator and ask them to vote yes on an override of SB 337 should it become necessary. The next thing you can do at the state level is you can join the ILGVP coalition. You can join either as an individual or on behalf of your faith or community organization. And the reason I really would love to see everyone in this room join the coalition is because you can accomplish two things that way. You can find out when and how to take action on future state-level gun safety legislative initiatives. There will be more because we now have, it's yet to be fully determined, but it looks like we're going to have a supermajority of gun sense elected officials in the Illinois General Assembly by the time all of the mail-in ballots are counted. And of course, we have a governor now who will sign our bills into law. So there will be more gun safety legislation coming at the state level, and we're going to need the help of as many Illinois citizens as possible to get them passed. The other thing that you can do by joining the Illinois Gun Violence Prevention Coalition is you can help us do the most important thing of all, which is to change the culture around guns. And this next sentence, if you're following along in your handout, is other than we are winning in the fight against gun violence, what you see here, this last paragraph, is the second most important thing I'd like you to take away today. Joining the coalition can help you learn about how we have one problem in this country. We don't have 7 or 8 problems. We don't have a domestic violence problem and a lack of appropriate mental health care problem and a lack of support for survivors of gun violence problem and a hate crimes problem and a problem with a suicide rate that is too high. What we have is one problem, and that problem is violence. And the problem is greatly exacerbated by the easy accessibility of firearms in our society. By joining the coalition, you'll really learn that. The purpose of the coalition, which includes member organizations and individuals all across the state that are working to address each one of those 7 or 8 problems, the purpose of the coalition is to realize we're all in this together. Claire Van Landingham and Ryan Zeich were killed in Lake Forest, January 3rd, 2018. That was a domestic violence problem. The firearm restraining order, if it had been law at the time, could have prevented it. Commander Paul Bauer, has anyone heard that name before? Chicago police commander who was killed earlier this year, was shot and killed with an illegally trafficked firearm. SB 337, the bill I'm actually asking you to take action on, it doesn't just help people in underserved communities on the south and west side of Chicago. It helps people like Commander Bauer. We have one problem, and it's only by working together that we will solve it. We are winning, but we haven't won yet. And we will only win if we all come together and realize we're all in this together. Thank you.
Will the override vote take place with the new General Assembly or the current General Assembly who you were able to beat?
Yes. Yes, the override vote, if it happens, will happen the week after Thanksgiving. It's possible, we are hopeful, that Governor Rauner will change his mind, even though he's publicly stated several times he'll veto the bill. That was before he lost re-election. We're hopeful that he may change his mind, especially if we can drive enough calls and petition signatures into his office. If an override vote becomes necessary, it will happen about 2 weeks from now. If we are not able to override the vote, or if Governor Rauner does nothing with the bill, then the bill will die at the end of this year, as of December 31st, and we will have to reintroduce the bill in the next legislative session in January. Okay.
a couple of questions. The first one is just a comment that someone submitted. All parents should take the 12-week Lake Forest Police Citizens Academy to increase their awareness. Probably not a bad idea. I've heard good things about it. And here is a question. Any panelist who feels they have something to speak to on this, please just feel free. Students are taught to evacuate school during fire drills, which makes them sitting ducks to a shooter. How should we change how those are conducted, or should we change how those are conducted?
That's a tough question, but it's one that actually last week, administration from the high school in our district met with the fire marshal and fire representatives, and there has been information coming out from the state about a delayed evacuation, which is called Verify. So there is some conversation happening in schools about trying to verify, like rapidly looking at a fire panel, for example, to see where, in a rapid investigation of where a fire may be, because our schools have sprinklers and we have, our fire panel can identify the cause where the alarm went off. So there's talk right now. Right now our protocol is to rapidly evacuate a school. We haven't changed that, but just to be quite honest, it's a really good discussion that's happening between police and fire locally and with school administrators. So we'll have more direction on that, I would say probably next fall if we do change protocol. I also just wanted to point out that there was information about the Parkland shooter pulling the fire alarm. As we look more deeper into information and an analysis of that, it's also quite possible that he did not pull the fire alarm, that the fire alarm went off because he was using high-powered firearms in a small place. So that kind of is what spurred the conversation, but I think it's a good conversation for us to have.
Thank you. How do we talk about safety in a psychologically healthy way? Does talking help or hurt?
I think safety is a word that we talk about with kids from when they're very, very small. And I think we need to have those conversations that continue. I think when we talk about little kids, adults are able to protect them and provide a lot of safety in your home. But as they move into an expanding world, you've got to teach them to develop those strategies and skills for themselves. So I think it's really important that when we talk about safety, some of the ways that we might do that really effectively are things like I heard were happening here around that universal curriculum. When you were talking about those, the ISB guidelines, Illinois was actually the first state in the country to have social emotional learning guidelines. They've been in place since 2004. Which is a long time. Unfortunately, it was an unfunded mandate, so no one's really tracking. But I think a lot of times I call bullying prevention, I don't know if you agree with this, a gateway drug into SEL. Because if we can't just say no, just like say no to drugs didn't work so well, say no to bullying doesn't work so well, but saying yes to what does it mean to be respectful and kind and to accept people for who they are and to have conversations and to solve problems are the kinds of skills we need to be teaching. And I think if we can raise our children just like we raise them to be safe on, I talk about that with the internet, for example. You know, I've shown both teenage girls, and they've all seen all kinds of videos about the things that can happen with your voice text. So reminding your child, we saw that statistic that over a third of kids said they would meet someone they met on the internet. That is crazy. And we are not having these conversations. So if you think your kids are the one kid out of 3 that are going to make a good choice, great, but guess what? A lot of them are not. So I think talking about safety and what it means to be safe and what our adult roles are to keep kids safe is important. Kids are scared. It's not like people are afraid to bring things up because they're afraid we're going to create a crisis. Don't ask about suicide. That is not true. What we know is the worst thing you could do is not ask. And so we as adults, when I talk to kids about mental health, they'll tell me they're much more comfortable talking about it than their parents. So we as adults need to think about that statement and think about what we're conveying when we don't have those open conversations with our children. But kids want to feel safe. They know it's your job. The protective shield is the adult's responsibility, and it's pretty fragile right now, and so we need to be honest and try to build it back up.
Thank you. I don't know what this means, but I'm guessing you two probably do. When will schools implement full trauma-informed care for all personnel?
Well, about that. So I think trauma-informed care, so I mentioned that briefly, the notion that you are training everyone at every level to be thinking differently about how we make kids feel safe and how we train our adult staff. What we think is that the word trauma and trauma-informed is becoming a bit of a buzzword. We're a little bit worried about that at the Illinois Childhood Trauma Coalition. We've been at this now for about 15 years because people are saying, oh, I've been trauma trained because I went to a 1-hour webinar. What we really think is you need to have a lot of training to understand the things that I flew through this morning, this afternoon, about trauma and the effects on the brain. And then you have to be taught not just the lens, not just how it affects development in the brain, but what can you do in whatever field you work in to create new practices. And a large part of that is also really training the adults to take care of themselves. I think we have a huge turnover rate. About 50% of new teachers leave teaching in the first 5 years. I just heard a story this week about people leaving mental health to go work at Aldi because they can get paid more. So we have these really intense roles with education and mental health, and we're not training the people to recognize the signs and symptoms of the distress that they're carrying with them. So part of that training is not just teaching kids new skills, but it's really teaching adults how to take care of themselves and to monitor their own stress so that they can be there for the kids. So when we talk about a trauma-responsive school climate, our hope is that we are going to move towards having that across the state. Right now, Chicago Public Schools is probably the leader in this, which is because they've had to be. But increasingly, I'm getting calls from districts all over the state asking for this help, and we are looking to lead an initiative where we would use that tool that I shared, that trauma-responsive school checklist, to get school districts across the state to assess where they are now and to move forward with that, as well as to get resources and training to help them to move that through, to do it wisely and in a model that makes sense for the rest of the state. So it's coming. If you want to help, I'd love to have you join the Illinois Childhood Trauma Coalition and we can talk about it.
Thank you. I think this one is for Sarah. How does legislation address previously identified mental health issues?
I missed a key word there. Can you repeat it?
How does legislation address previously identified mental health issues?
Okay. Previously identified mental health issues. Well, I think it depends on the bill and the law. But the firearm restraining order, for example, if someone, I'll give you an example. About 2 months ago, 3 months ago, I live in Vernon Hills. I live in a community, a neighborhood called Hawthorne Club. The neighboring community called Deer Path, which is literally just right around the corner from me. There was a man, a husband, who had been called 8 times in the previous 5 to 6 years because of a domestic violence disturbance. The police were called again because of a similar situation. It was about midnight, and he had a gun. When the police arrived, they asked that he put the gun down repeatedly. He refused to do it, and he ended up being shot by the officer on duty. And I would just like to, well, in answer to the question, they knew for sure that this person had a history of domestic violence abuse. The firearm restraining order, which will not be in effect until January 1st of next year, if it had been in effect, either the family member of that gentleman or law enforcement. Law enforcement in Vernon Hills was fully aware. They were the ones that had been called 8 times before. Once firearm restraining order becomes law enforcement or a family member will be able to have that gun removed from the possession of someone with a history like that. But the other thing I'd like to say is that story always makes me think of a couple of things. First of all, in my neighborhood, the average price of a home is nothing like Lake Forest, but it's still an affluent community. It's probably $600,000, $700,000 is the average price of a home in my community. So this happened literally around the corner from me. And what I'd like to keep that in mind. Domestic violence is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter what community you live in, if it's on the south side of Chicago, the west side of Chicago, Waukegan, North Chicago, Lake Forest, Vernon Hills, it doesn't matter. It's a problem everywhere. The other thing I'd like you to keep in mind is why do you only hear about the gun violence in the media that's happening on the south and west sides or in Waukegan? That story that I just told you was in a small 1 or 2 paragraph story in the Daily Herald. There was some talk about it online for about half a day. And then it was gone, and no one ever talked about it again. What I want everyone to realize is that it's not that Austin or Englewood or West Lawndale has a problem. We all have a problem. And just because you're not hearing about it doesn't mean it's not here in your community. And that's why I'm going to keep beating the dead horse here, but that's what we really need, is for people in every community to realize we're all sharing the same problem, and we all have to work together to solve it.
Thank you.
Answered more than one question. I admit it.
Dr. Weimer, at District 67, how early do you talk to kids about school shootings, and how do you customize your message based on grade level?
That's an important question. We have to make sure that what we're teaching kids is developmentally appropriate. And so at the younger grades, we do lockdown drills as early as preschool. We have a preschool in one of our elementary schools, kindergarten and up, and we do our mandated drills, and we actually exceed that and do a few more. And local law enforcement helps us. And for example, with our little kids, we say, if somebody were to come into your classroom and it looks like they want to hurt you, here's what you can do. We kind of dovetail it with our health curriculum, which is sort of the stranger danger, right? Like, what would you do if somebody grabbed you in a park? And we're hoping that parents are having those conversations with their kids. But we look at, if someone tries to hurt you, what could you do? And then we have them in their classroom. For example, during a lockdown drill, they have to immediately get up. We say, like, to the little kids, it would be look, listen, do. Look at your teacher, listen to the direction, and do what is expected of you. And they practice how they could sit in the classroom where they wouldn't be within view of an open window that may be in the interior door, for example. And so we just equate it with, if somebody wanted to harm you, what would you do? And then it sort of escalates from there. And our school resource officer in 5th grade does a much deeper dive. The kids work with our school resource officer in 5th grade to identify what would you do in this situation, and then it goes into more of how could you defend yourself. You can throw objects, for example, at the intruder's head. You try to get away, things like that.
Thank you. Our students taught see something, say something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we want to actually publicize that more. See something, say something, or do something, meaning, but certainly seeking adult help immediately. When there's a thing in the literature called leakage, where kids are actually some of the first people to know. So leakage would be if a student is talking to another student about something that is violent or threatening, if they're starting to draw in a journal or on the edges of their paper some violent imagery, if they're writing in a journal or poetry or even a piece for a class that shows that there's some disturbed intent there, a lot of times it's the other kids that find out long before the teacher. When the question came up about how do we train our staff, well, for some of the deeper counseling piece, that's usually a specialized area for like social worker or psychologists. But we want to make sure that all teachers and teacher assistants and office staff, that they know how to recognize when there's a problem, and we have problem-solving teams or administrators available if staff brings that to someone's attention.
Can I just add that I think similarly with suicide, we also know that just like kids are more likely to know about kids that are plotting to do something dangerous to others, they also are more likely to know if someone's thinking about hurting themselves. So that issue of stigma reduction and having these conversations and having children be able to come forward and ask adults for help is really important. And similarly with mental health, I think even the red flag rule is limited. So it's really limited in that you don't take away someone's gun forever because they've had a history of mental illness. Most people who have a diagnosis of mental illness are not going to hurt anyone. And it's really important that people know that. What we need to do better is assess risk and impulsivity and have open conversations so that people who are hurting are also getting the help that they need, because we don't want to make it further stigmatizing of mental health. And I think that's a tricky topic as well.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I've got just 2 more questions. Before I get to those, I want to say, don't forget to stop at the information table in the back corner. We have Sarah's petitions that she mentioned, and she's also brought a number of different handouts. We have one that we've printed out as well on gun violence in America. Do be sure and take a look at that as you get some coffee. When we're after our final 2 questions, please stop at the league table just outside the door if you didn't already. If you are not a member and would like to get some membership information, we have it there. If you are inspired to become a member right now, we have forms there. Also, all of our events are, no, not all, most of our events are free of charge to the public, like this one, but we always are happy to take donations. So we do have a donation jar. If you just want to throw $1 or 2 in there, it's always welcome. Okay, final 2 questions. This is for Ingrid. When will the transition program at District 115 have the same safeguards as general education? Currently, there are none. I realize it's probably not fair to ask you about District 115 since you do not oversee that, but if you have any insight on that.
Yes, I know that has been a topic, but it's hard for me to address it since I only work in District 67 and not 115, but I think it's really important that we protect all of our students, whether they're on our main campus or a satellite campus, so I'm definitely supportive of those conversations that are happening to make sure that all students in our programs have adequate safety provisions.
Thank you. This final question is probably a consequence of something that Sarah left us with, but I would like any or all of you to weigh in on it if you could. With violence identified as the core problem, what do we do to address violence? Very open-ended there.
I think we listened to Ingrid and, I'm sorry, Colleen. Yeah, I mean, that's a good place to start, right? Because it starts with children.
There's a lot of research that have come out, and it's actually something that we already intuitively as teachers would know, but to reduce problematic behaviors for students that are causing gross disruptions in our learning environments, it's so important that we're proactive in building a sense of school connectedness. Students need to feel a sense of belonging and connectedness and engagement. High engagement, high energy for their own learning, empowerment that they are doing things that lend themselves to their strengths, that they're interested in, that they want to come to school in the morning. And the part about being connected, like we need to send a really strong message to kids that when they're not there, it matters. Our school isn't the same. It's not as good when they're not there. We want them to be there. We want to promote positive contributions and connectedness and engagement. And I've always said when I was a principal that every student deserves to walk through the threshold of our door and feel confident and feel comfortable and feel connected. And that is the foremost. Kids aren't going to learn and grow and be ready for the next level if we don't have that intact long before they learn their addition or subtraction facts.
And just to add to that, I think hurt people hurt people. When people are hurting and we don't provide them the help that they need, they're much more likely to hurt others. And so I think we need to equip people with both all the prevention strategies, starting with little kids. You can use Sesame Street has great violence prevention stuff for little ones. So we can start as early as preschool and work through, but we need to both teach people to be more empathic of other people's hurting, and then also teach people skills so that they can both be those bystanders. We know that in schools, it's the bystanders that stop bullying. It's not the bullies, it's those other kids. So we need to get that power back into people learning to step up and say, how do we want our community to be? And I think all the things that you're doing in your district are fantastic, and we need to see that happening in lots of other spaces, not just schools, but it's also churches and communities and everyone stepping up and saying, how are we going to treat people?
Thank you. Let's thank our presenters one more time. Oh,
comment,
sorry.
if I may. As I said a moment ago, I do think it begins with the children, but I'd like everyone to keep in mind that I feel very privileged in my work running the Illinois Gun Violence Prevention Coalition, because I see incredible organizations on a daily basis, individuals and organizations who are recognizing that hurt people in adult life as well. And some of the communities that you probably think of when you think of gun violence, there are a lot of organizations doing amazing, courageous work as violence interrupters, and in most cases these are people who formerly, earlier in their lives, were committing the violence themselves. And they're committing themselves to doing what Ingrid and Colleen are trying to do in schools with children. They're doing this kind of work in their communities with adults. So just because a child isn't taught conflict resolution, social and emotional learning, it doesn't mean that they can't learn it as an adult. And if you'd like to see examples of that incredibly inspiring work, you don't have to go to the South Side. It's happening in Waukegan too. I'd love to take you there. So there's hope for all of us, adults and children alike.
Let's thank all our presenters one more time.
It would be good to remind people, although we mentioned it earlier, that all of this has been filmed by the local municipal cable, and I think it'll also be on their website.
Yes, it will. Thank you, Terry. Video from this event will be available as soon as our friend Bill is able to have it ready for us. And it will be on our website. You'll see on the home page an article about this event, and you'll see watch the video. Just click through on that. LWV, LFLB.org. It works even without the hyphen, actually. And then don't forget to check out our resources. And in fact, if any of you have resources you'd like to add to it, please just email them to me and I'll put them up there. And again, if you have not been able to fill out the feedback form here, please go ahead and do it online. Thanks so much.